This is a presentation over chapters 1 through 3 in the Cayman Music Appreciation Book of the Romantic period. The first chapter is entitled Romanticism in Music, and the Romantic period goes from 1820 to 1900 about. Just a quick overview. The most significant composers are as listed. So you have Franz Schubert, Robert Schumann, Clara Wieck Schumann, Friedrich Chopin, Franz Liszt, Felix Mendelssohn, Hector Berlioz, Bedřich Smetana, Antonin Dvorak, Peter Ilich Tchaikovsky, Johannes Brahms, Giuseppe Verdi, Giacomo Puccini, and Richard Wagner. Most music in the Romantic period were based on expression of emotion, and a lot of it is also based on the Classical period, but it has expanded greatly from the Classical period to accompany these new expressions of emotion. And also, these Romantic composers often broke from the standards of music, and that led to a lot of individualism and a lot of different sort of types of music. Some of the characteristics of Romantic period music is that it is really mostly a reflection of the composer's individuality, because each different composer had a different experience and they wrote music based on those experiences. And for people who have a trained ear, they could really identify a composer in a matter of seconds because of how individualized these pieces are. And also a common theme for these pieces are love and romance, as you can see as demonstrated here. You have love and you have romance. Perhaps these should have been switched, but I think you get the idea. And also what's interesting is that nationalism had a big factor for some. So composers like to write about music based on folk songs and about their country and how they felt towards their empire or country at that time. And a lot of composers also like to write music from other places, like, so if someone's from France, they could, write about, compose about China and use thematic motifs from China because they felt it was mysterious and remote. And so this sort of obsession for more foreign and different music expanded to this. Also, music becomes a lot more relevant as an art form because music starts to be embedded with literature, basically. So an example of this would be Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. Obviously, this was much before, long before this Romantic period, but Tchaikovsky created a piece, a series of compositions to sort of emulate the emotions and the mood portrayed through Romeo and Juliet. And so he uses instrumentation and sounds to depict these certain emotions through his compositions. And the timbre of music and tone color become very, very important, much more important than the Classical period during the Romantic period. And again, these ideas are expanded from the Classical period, built from them. And the orchestra was expanded to nearly 100 instruments. The horn section gets a good increase because it has more valves. And this is partly because of, this is mostly because of composers having the urge to expand their harmony, expand the range of instruments, so that they had to add more valves to in order for this to happen. And through this, the orchestral sounds were improved with things like the harp and the cymbals and the triangle. Also, the piano becomes top dog. Let's talk more about the piano for one quick point here. Just like the trumpets, the piano has an extended range, and the quality of pianos greatly increases. So, like the materials and the amount of sound, its loudness increases. And also, some more characteristics is that Romantic period music emphasizes the complex and rich harmonies. So they really like to have a rich harmony in the background, and these harmonies often contained chromaticism, so they would stray from the normal scales in which they were using and add chromaticism to give it more of a complex factor and be more mysterious. And keys would often change, and resolution was not as straightforward as it was in the classical period, so you'd often have things that didn't sound like they were resolved properly, and then it would end and you would be left very upset. And dynamic-wise, the dynamics were a lot more similar to, I would say, the Baroque period than the classical period, because dynamics would change pretty suddenly, and they would change frequently. So in the classical period, you had the dynamics would slowly change, so you'd have this a gradual crescendo or something. But now we're sort of going back to the Baroque, where it's like, oh, all of a sudden the dynamics have changed, and it's crazy, and it's frequent. And oh yes, these pictures. This represents harmony. Harmony. Okay. Also, again, most instruments, besides the piano and the trumpet, most instruments increased the range. So you'd add more valves or add whatever to increase the range of them. And also in the compositions, there was more rubato, which was just a tempo change, a sudden tempo change. And you have certain forms that you see in this now, as opposed to the classical period. You have miniature forms and monumental form. And of course, there's things in between, but we'll get into that. So basically, the miniature forms are a piece that is written as a miniature is a small work that's meant for piano. And it's basically because they were meant to be played at home in a middle class home, because the middle class really increased during this time, and most people had pianos if you were middle class. And these monumentals were for large compositions, as in like those 100-instrument compositions that were made for orchestra and concert halls. So to demonstrate this, I decided this is something that is mini. So you can sort of tie that to miniature. Just imagine a piano being here, I guess, and then you can remember that. Miniature. Let that sink in for a minute. I'll also mention monumental. This is, if you're not aware, this is Colossus from ancient Greek mythology. Colossus is monumental. So therefore, it is monumental. I'll let that sit in for a minute. All right, I think we're ready to go on. Again, the idea that Romantic period music is largely based on the classical period, but it's much more complex and greatly expanded. And let's talk about the thematic transformation. Basically, themes had to be, because of there were such long compositions that went for hours and hours for orchestra and whatnot, in these monumentals. They would have to be unified through themes, because if they weren't unified through these themes, you would think that they're completely different pieces, because it's 3 hours long. How do you unify a 3-hour long piece? Well, you use the theme over and over again, and you change it slightly. And this man right here was the pioneer for all that. His name is Beethoven. I never understood why he looked so mad. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the Romantic composers. Basically, freelance success from Beethoven. Again, Beethoven's the pioneer here. It inspires composers to completely change their roles in society. So a lot of people become freelance musicians. But unfortunately, a lot of these freelancers became freelance musicians because they didn't want to, but because of economic and political climate change. With events such as the French Revolution, and just overall a political climate change to overthrow like the past forms of monarchy and government as such. So there's a lot of change during this period, and thus, due to the economic and political changes, people had to change their positions in life, and especially musicians, because they would work in the court, and then all of a sudden there would be no court. So they kicked them to the curb. Composers often used pleasure as the main idea for music, so they created music not for the money, but because they enjoyed it, which is, I think, the right answer. That's the way to go. Yeah, and the middle class grows a lot more. Orchestras are made because of this. More orchestras are made because of such a rising middle class, so they make more orchestras to accompany for this rise in musicians. Also, many music conservatories are established, such as the Juilliard School in New York City, New York. You may have heard of it, but it is perhaps one of the most established schools, music conservatories in the United States. And it's mostly across Europe, though, but there are places in the United States. This was not established during this time. Don't get me wrong here. So, yeah. Solo recitals become a lot more popular by musicians because they had to accompany for, they had to arrange themselves so that they could play and earn money. Although they didn't do it for pleasure, they still had to make money. So, yeah. And again, the piano was owned by most middle-class citizens, so there was a large increase for sheet music for piano. And because of this, there were a lot of operas and compositions that were transcribed for the piano so that middle-class citizens could play them. And that increased sort of the economy of musicians as well. And it was in the classical period, you see this thing where Beethoven and Handel and musicians such as them had their parents were musically inclined, and they basically forced their kids into music. So, but now in the Romantic period, you see a lot of musicians, most musicians, in fact, no longer really have this musical background because it's such an increase of musicians. And in fact, it was sort of the opposite happened because the parents thought that it was not stable enough as a job, and so the musicians often had to beg their parents to go into such a profession. Ooh, my favorite, the art song. So the art song is a composition for piano and a voice. And again, this is really going for the middle class civilians with the piano. And gotta love that piano. So poetry and the art song are basically infused together because, again, as I mentioned before, poetry, literature, and music sort of comes together in the Romantic period. And so this is really a good example of that happening. And most of these songs talk about the human soul and the despair of love. It's very sad, but inspirational at the same time. So you see a lot of German and English songs about love and sadness. And a lot of these poems that you have already previously created were actually translated into music, into these art songs. So that's nice. And they use word painting to do so. And the mood was often set with a piano introduction. So you'd have a piano introduction that introduces it, and then it ends with a piano introduction, or piano. It ends with a piano postlude is what it's called. So postlude. And I thought I'd share some pianos. These are specifically my pianos that I own. I have a couple more, but I do not have them with me currently. So this one's Corgi because it's a Korg. This one is a freebie. It's a spin it. Kind of sucks, but I got it for free, hence the term freebie. So yeah, and this one's Grammy. It's not very old. In fact, it's probably the newest one out of these. But it feels completely plastic because it is. And I think it was my sister's, and my grandma gave it to my sister, and I stole it from my sister. So now it's mine. Let's talk about strophic and through composed form. Strophic form is basically a musical theme that is repeated for each stanza of a poem. So if you have 3 stanzas, you have the same musical theme for each stanza. Through composed form is you have a different theme for each stanza of a poem. So if you have 3 stanzas, each stanza sounds different, or slightly different at least. And then you have other forms besides these, such as the modified strophic form, which is using an ABA structure. So you have, again, if you have a 3-stanza poem, you have one, the first stanza would be A, and then it changes to the second stanza, and it has a different sort of theme and different mood. And then you go back to the original theme and mood of A. And this is not the American Basketball Association. This is ABA format. Don't worry about the basketball. Chapter 4, you may go now.